Everyone, and welcome to this optimised session, embedding social value into bid strategies. My name is Lindsay Robertson and I work in the marketing team here at Visible Thread. Thank you so much for joining us for this session today. Before we get started, just a few things to note. You'll see a Q&A box on your screen. This will be a really interactive session, so please submit your questions as we go through. We've dedicated the second half of this session to answering your questions, including those that have been pre-submitted, so thank you so much for doing that. You'll also see an attendee chat, so feel free to add your comments and thoughts in there as we go along as well. And we'll be sharing the slides and recording after the session today. So today's session will be led by Quincey Ankrett, who is Executive Director at E50K Strategic Advisory. And Quincey has a huge amount of experience in social value, ESG and sustainability strategies. So we're so excited to have our expertise for this session today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Quincey.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that warm welcome, and welcome everyone to Embedding Social Value into Bid Strategy. So before we start, a small nudge to semantics. Obviously, we've got people from a wide variety of countries on the call. I am, in fact, in the UK, and the term that we use is social value. However, you may be used to hearing ESG, sustainability, social responsibility, even how can we just provide additional value. So I would encourage you to think throughout the session on the topic in its most broadish brush. So there are many things that organisations can do to successfully embed social value into their bid strategies. Now, we can't cover all of them in the time that we've got. So what we're going to do is take a rundown on 3 of the most pressing concerns. So first and foremost is committing holistically to the strategy, ideation, submission, delivery, measurement, and reporting. And this holistic view that we're going to talk about later on is becoming increasingly important. The second is we're going to talk about buyer expectations in this area, and they are on the rise. So standing out in competitive tenders has become much harder as that baseline standard increases. And then finally, we're going to look at how companies can often struggle with the push and pull of social value delivery versus best case commercials, and what we can do to look at that together. So we're going to go through insights and then a practical approach related to those insights, and then an example. I'm going to go through 3 of those. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about that committing piece. So in terms of the insight, the social value component of your bid strategy should be considered as part of the holistic whole within the bid. And we're suggesting you give it the same weight as any other component of your bid. Now, we've seen, in the UK, we've seen social value sections of bids account for up to 22% of the marks. 22% is the highest we've seen. So this means that there could be areas within your bid where these questions are weighted heavier than some of the technical or non-technical responses. Now, social value alone won't win you the contract, but it may well lose it for you. And so we're going to talk about a practical approach to the strategy. So what we're suggesting is to mirror your current bid strategy position for social value. So everything that you consider, each step that you consider in your bid process, we would encourage you to integrate social value into that. So if we take a look at a real life example, this is taken from our bid strategy, and there are 8 steps that we would consistently go through. So for example, in the natural order of your decision gates, you will of course be considering the budget or the price point, and you should be doing the same thing for your social value. How much is this going to realistically cost us? And when we talk about cost, we're not just talking about physical money, monetary spend. We're talking about everything that goes into that piece. So if you are suggesting that one of your members of staff volunteer or deliver pro bono work, for example, whilst they're not doing their day job, the cost of that day, of them for that day, still should sit inside the price point of your social value. And you need to consider that in the same way you would commercials for any other part of the contract. So how much is this a must win? Where do we want to fix ourselves? How much do we want to win? Can this be a loss leader for us, etc. Step 2, we'd be looking at the kind of governance, resource, and the wider strategic impact for this. So obviously you would be considering the resource and governance within the wider contract delivery in the bid, and we would encourage you to do the same thing for your social value. Who's going to look after it from the top all the way down to boots on the ground? Who is going to ensure that it links in with your wider strategy if you have one? And if you don't have a business level or corporate level, group level strategy for your social value, that's something to consider. What you're delivering at contract level should feed into your strategic goals for the business as a whole in this area. Step 3, we've got understanding that clients need. This is an absolute imperative, and you would do this for every other element of the bid. You would want to understand that you're delivering the right technical response for whatever product or service it is that you're delivering. And this would be the same thing for your social value. What is it that the client needs? And obviously, if you're not sure, you could feed that into step 4, which is the black hat of the competitive landscape. So you need to consider what I'm so sorry, there's somebody at my door, just want to know. I'm so sorry. Do apologize for that. So you need to consider in that inside step 4. So if you're taking a black hat view of the competitive landscape, how does the client need fit into what you're delivering and also all your competitors? In terms of step 5, you would of course be considering your own USPs and be developing your own value proposition. And we'd encourage you to do the same thing for your social value so that you can fully understand what it is that you can deliver, what it is that you can't deliver, and what your USPs are in comparison to your competitors. Step 6 and step 7, obviously coming together, you would be crafting a competitive response, and you'd want a response that is innovative. And this is no different for the social value piece. It needs to be well written, reviewed, refined, and you need a plan on how you are to deliver it going forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we innovate and how we create a competitive narrative later on. And then finally, you're going to submit and prepare. And when we talk about prepare, we're talking here about what will happen when you win the contract. So how will you mobilize this? And you should be considering that in the same way that you would every other part of the statement of work. So we'd encourage you to ensure that the social value sits inside your mobilization plan, so that the client, the authority, understands that you take this issue seriously and you will put markers and KPIs against yourself to deliver it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about those buyer expectations. So we mentioned before, buyer expectations are on the rise, and standing out in the competitive tender process has become much harder. And this will become more difficult as time goes on. And that's because people are starting to understand, 1, what they need to deliver, 2, they're delivering more as time goes on, and there also is an increasingly high standard of what needs to be delivered in order to be competitive. So to be truly competitive and craft that compelling solution for your social value in your bid strategy, there's 2 things that you need to consider. And the first is understanding the baseline delivery of the sector, and the second is creating something new and interesting. Now, you can't do number 2 without doing number 1. So we need to understand what is being delivered. So when we talk about this in a practical approach, we want to consider what is the baseline and how do we find that out. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about the commitments that we see time and time again from tenderers. So this could be things like apprenticeships, one-off charitable giving, free webinars, well-being programs. These are things that we see time and time again that are submitted by clients at tender stage. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that delivery. In fact, the client or the authority is expecting to see those things now. But what they're also expecting to see is something in your response that is not in your competitors, that makes you stand out from everyone else. So to talk about a practical example, back in 2024, we looked at reviewing a multi-million pound nuclear bid. And as part of the strategy planning, we looked at 18 of the largest contributors to the UK spend from that industry. And we did a desk-based review as part of the Black Hat and we looked at all the outward facing material. So not internally from the company we were working with, because we couldn't do that for any of the others. And when doing this, we need to be comparing apples with apples, not apples with pears. So we took a look at all the outward facing material for 3 months, including the websites, reports, social media, and we analysed that for trends. And what we were looking for were items that were delivered by all 18 of those companies, or a significant number of them. Now, we benched that ourselves at 85% of them. So if 85% or more of those companies were delivering an item or a commitment, so let's, for example, use apprenticeships, every single one of those 18 were delivering apprenticeships. That becomes a marker on the baseline. And when we did this review and we'd completed it, we ran the data, there were 187 individual commitments or markers that those 18 primes were all delivering. Now that's a huge amount. And if you think about bids that you've perhaps written in the past and social value responses that you've given, I can't imagine that any of you have written 187 commitments in that. We didn't write 187 commitments into the multi-million pound nuclear bid. So it becomes really important, one, to consider which one of those baseline items do we need to consider? What do we make sure we have to put in? And then how do we choose items or innovate new items that can allow us to deliver more? Now, if you could just move the slide one on for me, please, Lindsay. I want to show you what this physically looks like. So for those of you in the UK, you'll notice that the MAC 2 through 8 at the bottom of the screen relates to the 2020 social value model. So we've got things down here of how are you going to support SMEs, entrepreneurship, through MAC 4, which is the environmental piece, MAC 5, supporting those with a disability, and MAC 6, those kind of opportunities for those in barrier groups, 7 as well-being, and 8 as community connectivity. So what we see here on the graph is where those 187 items sit. Now, obviously, when you go to give your tender response, you're not writing, or variably not writing, about everything. Usually, they will give you, this is the topic that we want to understand, this is what we want to know where you're going to commit to. So this gave us and we were able to deliver to client an overarching view of what the standard looks like for those 87. So when, unsurprisingly, looking at this graph, we were asked to deliver on both MAC 4 and MAC 6, we already knew what the competitors were delivering, what we were delivering, and what we needed to do to innovate for that second piece. The next slide, please. Thank you. So the final insight is related to the social value and commercials piece. So social value can be a really tough commercial sell in the bid room, and this is something we get asked about quite a lot. The need to balance the support for the economic, social and environmental good with tight budgeting and the need for commercial success, especially when you want to innovate away from that baseline, because innovation tends to include higher budget. So in terms of the practical approach for delivering that, at E50K, we advocate to create social value commitments which deliver against business as usual needs and that are fully integrated into your bid response. Now, operationalizing aspects of your social value response provides the value for money that commercial are seeking. It also increases the delivery success with buy-in for your team, because it will be more integrated into the job roles that they do. It will also allow you to create ideas which are unique and specific to that tender. And we'll talk about it a little bit later on because it's something someone asked about in the questions. But there's always the notion of you need to use the lift and shift test. So if you can take a commitment and the written piece around that commitment, if you can lift it out of your current tender and drop it into another one with no changes whatsoever, it's not specific enough to the contract that you're delivering. So what does this look like in terms of a practical example? So what I've done here is given you an example of client delivery that we have managed in the past. So we had a soft facilities management company come to us, and they were spending over £1 million on agency staff for several minimum wage entry level jobs, things like cleaning, catering, gardening. And whilst initial recruitment volume was quite high, the roles had really poor retention and high turnover. And it was from the 8-week point that this happened. So this is not, this relates to how we help people come up with new social value ideas. So I will never sit in a bid room and ask you, what do you think we should deliver for social value? Or how can we write responses that fit into economic growth, for example, or helping the environment? Because this is a strategy that does not work. Instead, we ask people to tell us what the current, and we call them pebbles, we don't call them issues, what the current pebbles are. What are the things that the tiny pebble inside your shoe doesn't stop you from walking, but it is a real annoyance the entire way through your walk. And these could be really big things and they could be really small things. But we take a look at those. So if you could roll the slide on for me. The solution that we came up with was twofold. And the first part was to create a new rotational working program where all the entrants from all 4 service lines who were new entrants to the business, and also any from the continuous service who wanted to opt in, were placed on a 3-month rolling program. And it was across all 4 service lines. So they all spent 3 months learning the set of skills from each of the 4 service lines. And then when they'd finished that, they would be able to select 2 or 3 lines to go forward. And what this did was increased the retention past 8 weeks, because even if they didn't like one 3-month section, they would be saying to themselves, oh, I just get past this bit and then I know I'll be in gardening and I know I'm going to like that because I like being outside. So it reduced that initial turnover. So far more people got through to the 12-month period. And from that point on, they then were able to select the job roles and lines that they wanted to work in based on the experience of actually doing those jobs. And again, that drastically increased the retention. And then the second part was that concurrently, we launched a barriers to work program. So we invited those not currently in education, employment or training, people with a learning disability or physical disability, and some ex-offenders to a 3-day ethos course, which was free to attend. And we found these people from particular community partnerships. So these are people that were already signed up perhaps to other community programs or were known to community partners, that we were then able to sift those individuals through and invite them to the course. And we took as many people as wanted to come. We taught them about the company. We taught them about policy and ethos and why we're doing what we're doing, why we do it in that particular way, to give them an idea and to cover some of the more basic insurance and safety-led processes. And then we invited them for a guaranteed 4-week paid placement. And post-placement, they could then apply for a job in the rotational programs. And they would then get a buddy who'd already been through the rotational program. They go through it together and the same process ensues. Now, year 1 saw an increase in cost due to setup. So it was more than 1 million at the start. But we also have training fees, obviously, to set up. But after that, the agency fees continued to decrease and decrease and decrease. And retention figures were up 42% 3 years after that. Now, this we sold as a social value response. And if you click next for me, I'll show you the social value that it covers. So what we've got, and these are linked to the UK's new social value model for 2025. And there's a copy of that at the end of this, a quick fix copy of this at the end of the presentation for when we send out, because I think people find that quite useful. And those were education and training for those with barriers to work, same as employment opportunities for the same group, learning and skills development to address gaps inside their own contract workforce, collaboration and co-design with those community partners that helped us find the individuals to come through for part 2, actions to increase the representation of those with a disability inside the contract workforce, but also removing barriers for entry for young people and underrepresented groups, and creating a pipeline of opportunity for the future workforce. So those items now sit across 6 areas of the new social value model. So it doesn't matter which one of the 6 questions of 8 they could possibly ask, you could fit them into any one of those. And that's the final point in terms of innovation. We never try to innovate to solve the social value problem, try to innovate to solve an operational problem. And then what's great about this approach is that if you can then link to social value at the end, fantastic. You can use it as a social value response inside your bid. You can also mention it throughout the other sort of how are you going to resource, how are you going to ensure you have capability to deliver, those sorts of questions. What's also great about it is that if you can't find a social value link for it, what you've actually developed is a positive change management solution that is solving an existing issue, which you can take off and say, this is going to solve our agency use problem, for example. So 2 birds, 1 stone. Now, it's not easy to do, and it does take practice, and we have a variety of tools to help companies figure out some of these problems and then how they can link them into the social value. But that is how we create innovative programs, ones that stand out, that allow you to stand a head shoulders above your competitors. Next slide, please. I believe, Lindsay, you're going to manage the question panel. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that summary. That's really useful insight. So as Quincy said, we're going to open up now for Q&A. So just a reminder, if you have a question, in the box, we'll try and get through as many as we can. So there were quite a few that were submitted in advance, so we'll just kick off just now. So do you have any practical recommendations for balancing buyer expectations and supplier promises on contract such as public sector frameworks?
Yeah, great question. So this is an issue that we get asked about quite often. So where do I pitch if I don't know what the outcome is going to be? And I'll give you several sort of practical approaches. The first is to consider your evaluation of the win rate of call-offs, if it's from a framework, for example, which you would likely be doing at decision gates anyway. Is this something where we think it's really likely we're going to win work from it? What's the percentage of that? What are you likely to receive, and what are the assumptions that you made based on that? When you know that, you can then do one of the following 3 things. So the first might be to state your delivery as a percentage of work won. So, for example, for every £100,000 of work, we will deliver X, Y, and Z. And you can, of course, tailor X, Y, and Z based on how much money you're receiving. Now, this would require you to do a proxy matrix to say how much can you afford to do at each various price point, and what that looks like for each one of your commitments. It is a sizable chunk of work to do that, but if you are genuinely concerned that you would perhaps submit more than you can deliver, it's a great way to go. You could also, and this depends on the question and the framework, of course, and whether KPIs are attached to it, but you could outline your plans to work with all the key stakeholders and the client to then create programs which directly link to the statements of work, lots or call-offs. So what you're actually giving them is the how rather than the what. Now, this only works with certain types of questions. So on the other hand, you could also, again, considering the question and the framework, you could lay out an outline of what impact you're seeking to achieve, who you'll partner with, and and the way that you'll partner with them, and say how you'll build those projects together for the size of the contract that's won, citing examples or linking in with the first option. If in doubt, positive transparency is always really effective, and being as specific as you can. I think the people who are reading the frameworks are, of course, very well aware that you're not actually winning work off of that for the first port of call. So they should have an understanding that that is difficult for you to do. The other one, particularly for those of us in the UK, is obviously we've now got an increased amount of market warming exercises that they have to take us through. And we would encourage you to ask any and all questions, if it is a framework, on what they are anticipating and what they expect from that answer, but also to use that to be able to qualify to them, actually, in a framework, you shouldn't be asking us for commitments. They really shouldn't. What they should be asking is the how. They should be asking you, do you have policies? Do you have strategies? What impact in general do you want to deliver, and how are you going to do that? Who are you going to work with, etc., rather than the physical what. So if you have any influence on that as part of the process, then that will be really positive for you.
Absolutely, thank you. Secondly, how have you helped clients ensure proposals mentioning social value are backed by meaningful action?
This is a really good question. So we would coach clients to look at that holistic piece that we were talking about before. So things like governance and ownership. If you want meaningful action at the end, someone needs to own it. And depending on the size of your company, that could be a passionate individual who doesn't necessarily have social value in their day job title, but will be able to push it forward, all the way through to a team of people that can obviously push it. But it must have top tier or C-suite governance and support behind it to ensure that you do get those meaningful actions. Having a strategy, having a company-wide strategy, group strategy, sector strategy, and contract strategy. And these don't need to be long, lengthy documents. They can just be a couple of pages on what is it that you want to achieve, what impact are you trying to make. And they should be quite broad brush, so that the contracts that you're delivering, the commitments that you make, should then fit into that strategy. And if that strategy was created from a top-down, bottom-up, top-down process, it should fit well within the values and the ethos of your company, and therefore should get you much more meaningful action. You can also create those real links to the contract. So we talked before about the lift and shift test. That's how you know you're going to get really positive, meaningful action specific to that contract. If you can lift and shift it out, it's not specific enough. And linking that into the people who are boots on the ground who are going to deliver some of this for you. You can also look at that golden thread that we talked about throughout the bid. So where we mentioned for the nuclear client, the social value that we created for them actually was mentioned across 4 other questions throughout the bid. And in order to do that, one of the tools that we would suggest you'd use is to look at all the questions from the bid or the statement of work and pick out all the references to social value all the way through. And you'll find more than you think, all those subtle references. Pick them all out and say, this is where we need to be able to link in our solutions. And that'll also tell you perhaps which BAU problems you might be covering. Also make sure you've got objectives and KPIs and set them at the beginning so that you know that the impact you're seeking will be delivered by the objectives and the KPIs, and then measure and report them consistently. And you don't necessarily need an expensive tool to do this. You can Power BI and Microsoft Lists can do this for smaller companies, but make sure you're measuring and consider really carefully what you're measuring and what you want to report. What do you want your report to read like in a year's time, halfway through the contract, at contract end? What do you want to be able to show the client? And then we need to create projects and set KPIs based on what you want to show them.
Great advice there. Third question that came through is, how would you go about quantifying value in bids?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and it's obviously quite tricky for people because we are usually able to set KPIs, for example, and and select and quantify value really easily in some other areas of the bid, particularly in terms of the kind of technical demonstration. So the first piece is to link into the client's needs that we talked about before. Doing that will ensure that they immediately understand the value of what you're delivering. You are solving a problem. You could be solving a problem for yourselves, but you could also be solving a problem for them. And if you can solve their problem, they immediately will understand the value of what you're delivering. Context is also hugely important. I cannot stress enough how important this is. You will all have seen other people or your own social value reports that says, we have delivered £5.6 million worth of social value this year. And I look at it and I think, that's great. It's brilliant. But I have no idea how that sits with the size of your business. So as an example, Elton John's net worth is 650 million. If he were to give £3,000 to charity, you might think he was a bit of a skinflint, to be honest, but it would be, he's given the proverbial 50p down the back of the couch to charity. If I gave £3,000, that would be a significant amount of my monthly wage. And the context for that is really important. And it's especially important if you're a small business, because the reader needs to be able to see instantly, okay, you might have delivered only £3,500 of social value. But if you're only making, 50,000, then actually that's considerably more impressive than if you were making millions and millions. And what's really important for the small companies to do that is, as human beings, we just can't help but do the same thing. So as a reader, when I've been reading tenders, if someone puts that in, if they say we've delivered 26% social value of our overall net worth, for example, and they tell me what that is, when I go to read the following questions, every time someone else, one of your competitors, makes a statement, immediately in my head I go, wonder what that is as a percentage of turnover. And we just can't help doing that. And so what that means is you're sowing those seeds inside the reader's head of, is this significant? How much do I know about this company? How much are they delivering? What is their turnover? Is this a worthwhile statement? So that's really important. Two more things. One would be to measure quantitatively and qualitatively together and make sure you report those together. That's really helpful in itself. Different countries, different companies, different sectors put a different amount of value or worth on the pound spend. Some think it's incredibly important to say, this is the monetary value of everything that we've delivered. Other sectors say, actually, I don't think you can quantify that. We don't consider that as important. So you need to know whether it's more qualitative outcomes and outputs based, or qualitative depending on the audience. And then finally is to move beyond the output, and don't fall into the output only trap, because this will negatively impact on the value that you can quantify. So for example, the output of this webinar is a 45-minute presentation from me. But if I'd arrived and Lindsay put me in and none of you guys were here, I could still deliver my 45-minute presentation output, but there would be no outcome or impact from what I've delivered. But I could still write in my report, I delivered a 45-minute presentation, which is why outcome is so much more important as is impact than the output. And that's why you'll notice at the end, Lindsay is going to ask you to put scores on the doors of how much you know about social value, which you will all remember you did at sign up. And the reason for that is I will be using that as an output figure. What I'd like to be able to say is, before you came in, you knew this amount, between 0 and 10. And when we left, we saw a significant increase in that. That tells me I've actually affected my audience. And then The second part of that is the impact. So the actual impact rather than the outcome of this session would be, have any of you utilized any of these ideas? And the reason that's so difficult to do is because I'm not necessarily going to know what you guys have done when you've left. So that's quite difficult for me to then quantify the value.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Another question that has come up a couple of times is that we're finding that we must address social value requirements when they don't seem applicable to the product that we provide, and we've heard that a few times. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach this?
Yeah, we get this quite a lot. I'd say the first thing is that I genuinely believe that I can create social value to link to any contract. Now we can talk about how we're going to do that as an example, because it's easier to explain to you as an example. But first of all, I think it's really important to just have a brief chat on why this can sometimes happen. So when selecting the themes for social value, some authorities or clients focus too much on the contract delivery itself. They try and marry the two things up. So, for example, we supported a company that was bidding to provide support for people with a learning disability in the UK. And the authority chose a social value question, which was based on how will you provide additional support to people with a learning disability in your community as their social value question. And much of the, I guess, usual answer that you might cover from that, these guys were doing in their day-to-day business as usual. So it made the question so much harder for them to do. Now, I understand that the authority wanted to try and get more bang for their buck for those specific, that specific barrier group. But unfortunately, it just made for some fairly weak answers because it fitted too closely to business as usual. The other reason that this sometimes happens is because certainly in the UK, they might use the templated question, and often that doesn't really fit exactly with the specific contract. Now, you are allowed to tailor the questions. So again, when you're at market warming, we would suggest that you encourage them by asking, will you be sticking to the standardized question, or will you be tailoring it more specifically to this contract? And that suggestion, hopefully, will get them to link in more directly. So they're two of the reasons that this can sometimes happen. As I said, I believe we can find social value in everything. So we're going to do an example. I'm going to show you an example if we move the slide on. So this is one that I believe someone sent in as an example and that they were struggling with. So these are skiff rooms. You put the pictures up just in case you're unsure as to what they are. This is what the client delivers. So they are secure spaces that you can hold meetings in if you need to make sure that your material is not overheard. So we're looking at the kind of security of information, essentially. So with everything that we've talked about today, the first thing that I would always do is, for any contract, is to consider people, place, space, because there is always at least one of them in every contract. So if we look at this one first, let's look at people. So if you take a look at the second picture there, there's several things about the aesthetical look of the room, for a start. One is the lighting is really bright and quite evasive. It's also largely white or maybe slightly off grey, I think, from the picture. All the furniture is your kind of bog standard, plain, boring office desk stuff, and you've got, you know, your flip chart, etc., and the various bits that you need. Now, obviously, you have to be really careful what is in these spaces. However, there are so many things that you could do in that box to support the health and well-being of the people who are actually sat in it. As I can't imagine sitting in that box for 4 or 5 hours at a time. You know, in meetings that we all sit in, you would get up, you get yourself a cup of tea, you'd wander around, you stretch your legs, you go to the toilet. we just want to move about. Sometimes people take their shoes off and go and walk, out on the lawn, and then they come back in again. And this is because all of these things help us to focus. They reduce our stress levels and anxiety. They help us perform better in meetings. It is difficult to perform in that sterile space. So things that they could do, one as part of their social value, because this will link into the health and well-being of the people related to the contract, but also just generally to make the meeting more productive for that business as usual, is let's look at a color palette and let's look at furniture that actually supports people to be positive in that meeting space. The second thing being that imagine if you're sat in that space for 4 or 5 hours at a time, 2 or 3 hours at a time. When you get out of there, I can imagine that the first thing you're going to want to do is get outside into nature. So some of these can be in client offices, some of them are actually in personal homes, some of them are in government spaces. Wherever that is, can you provide somewhere local, either that you create yourself or that you support that's already up in existence with anchor partners, to provide a space where people can say, right, I've been sat in that box for 4 hours before I get in the car, get on the train, go home. I'm going to go and sit in local park that is just over the way. It is still directed to the linked to the contract, because you will explain in the tender why you are doing it. The second piece is to this for people is that these are prefabbed. They're either made or they're prefabbed offsite, and then they're moved to places. Now, there is a workforce that is doing that. There is real people doing that. So how are we supporting new entrants to those roles? That's the NEETs, the barrier groups, the youth. What's the workforce made up of? What's the diversity of it? How are you going to improve the skills of the workforce that is creating it? This all links to the contract, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the use of the container later on. We've also got supply chains. Who's making it? Where is it being created? Can we create them in low skill, low income deprived areas? If we can, then we immediately support the economic growth of that area. Who provides the logistics and the shipping? How do we move it? Are there any SME contracts related to it? Are there any new businesses that you could support that link into it? So even if you look at it's quite sparse, obviously, but even inside there, we've got somebody's got to provide that table. Someone's got to provide the chairs. Looks like an intercom type thing in the middle, but it might be recording. Someone's got to provide that. Someone's got to provide the flip chart and the projector. Where are these contracts? Who makes all these things? Where do you buy them from? And how do you utilize that to support the economic growth of the authority that you're currently in? And then we've got the actual product itself. It's basically a large shipping container of various different sizes. What's it made of? What's going to happen to it when it becomes obsolete for this contract and you're going to do something else with it? How can you link in, for example, with other community anchor partners to do things with that? There is a shipping company in the UK who gifted all their old shipping containers to local homeless charity, and they turned them into 1-bed homeless rooms that the guys who are homeless could come and utilize. And there's like a little community of them. And what that allowed is the community anchor partner did not have to pay for any of those things, and all it is an empty box at that point. Then we're going to look at energy consumption, heating, lighting, use, and how that will affect consumption in the rest of the building, and how can we reduce that. And then finally, we talked about that wider issues piece, and this contract is about information security. So how can we teach that to other people? How do we teach our young people, those going through university? How do we teach others, perhaps within our own supply chain, to understand the value of that? Now, domestic hacking is also it is a problem in a lot of countries, as well as foreign hacking. So can we teach our schools and our UD students to help young people understand the effects of hacking on our country and its links to organised crime, and to not go down that line? Tangentially, information safety is something that is now hugely important with a large online communities that we have, and with our young people. Can we volunteer to teach how we are safe online for those? I could go on and on and on, but I won't, because we've got more questions. But as you can see, there's a lot of ideas there. Now, you might not need them all. Not all of them might be effective. Not all of them might be useful for the questions that are actually asked of you. But coming up with as many ideas as you possibly can that physically link to that contract is the best way to differentiate yourself from others.
That's great. Thank you so much for that example. And tied to that, the next question was, does social value really influence RFP results? How do you authentically align your social value with that of your prospect?
Yep, again, it's a question that we get asked quite a lot. And even as a social value expert, I can be brutally honest with you to say social value is never going to win you a bid. If you put in a below standard technical response and a really good social value response, you are still not winning, but it might lose it for you. So if you think about your own company and your closest competitor at the moment, if you're both creating good products or services with great technical responses, with very similar price points, previously the lower price point would simply win out. But that is changing, and authorities and clients want to know what else you are going to give them outside of the statement of work and the technical response. And if the gap between the bid prices is fairly insignificant, sometimes even if it's not, they will look at the wider picture. How are you going to support their local economic growth, their SME use, jobs, skill support? And for that, they're coming to look at your social value response, because they want more from you. And so if you can deliver more from your social value response, that differentiates you, particularly when the price point and the product are really close. So it won't win you it, but it might lose you it. Now, we asked about authenticity and how do we make sure that it links to the prospect. So delivering authentically for your prospect, again, comes down to creating social value that directly links to your product and to the needs of the buyer. So what are their problems? How can you help solve them, as we talked about earlier? And also, there's the use of your own internal business social value strategies, written well and considered. Please, can you go back out? Thank you. Written well and considered from a top down and a bottom up for your strategy will ensure that you choose to deliver items that fit within your company's ethos and values. And if you've created those strategies with your clients in mind, they should then also automatically deliver on their values and their needs. And as we said before, that's how you're able to really quickly show the value of what you're delivering to them, and also aligning to your own organization's social value need.
Thank you so much. And we've just probably got time for one more question. I know there are a couple of others that have come through, so we'll definitely send those over to Quincey and come back with a response. So we'll make sure we respond to them all. Final question. Are defence and security organisations now exempt from mandatory social value requirements under the new UK Procurement Act?
So I'll start by saying I have a full 1 hour presentation purely on this topic, and if it's of interest, then certainly let the guys know at Visible Thread and we can possibly set something up to deliver that to you. So for the very small amount of time that we've got, under UK's new Procurement Act and the PPM, which relates to social value, it is deemed exempt for defence and security contracts if the outline of the contract falls within the parameters of Section 7 of the Act. Now, as I said, I could talk for well more than an hour on this topic, but the key things you need to know are that existing contracts must continue to deliver the social value promised in the ITTs. So you must continue to deliver that. I would suggest reviewing Section 7 if you procure if you deliver into the UK, if you're in the UK or you deliver into the UK, review Section 7 of the new Procurement Act and consider where your pipeline of future work sits. And if you're unsure, then make sure you attend market warming and ask them, do they see it fitting in? And then really carefully review the semantics of the Act. They give descriptions for most of the things that are listed in there, and some of them are quite obvious things that you would probably be expecting to see in there. So things like security, IT security contracts, contracts that are related to the delivery of items inside secure bases. That's not surprising to us. What is surprising is the wide range of things that they've deemed exempt that also link into that. So things like platforms, weapon systems. There's also some physical buildings and some contract delivery inside sites. So have a real close look at the semantics of that, and then ask at market warming. So we have been assured by Maria Eagle and Ben English that desk officers have the power to add social value if they see fit, despite the exemption. And we've seen this happen already. So we're responding to 3 things for clients that have landed this week for defence, and they all have social value with the new model in them. And some have even gone as far as so Defence Digital Commercial have gone as far as putting statements out confirming that they will continue to add social value to their procurements despite the fact that they are exempt now officially from the Act. And we are spending some time asking other branches of the MOD what their intentions are. And if we do end up delivering the 1 hour from there, I can share some insights because those meetings are next week. But for the most part, I would say the wording is key, and ask at market warming.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Quincey. I think we're almost up on time now. So really, really appreciate you taking the time out today to take us through that, and some amazing nuggets of information in there. As Quincey mentioned, I know a lot of you had completed the pre-event survey to give us a sense of your social value knowledge. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on the screen just now and just giving us a sense of, after this session today, where you feel you sit, in terms of your level of understanding, and that will give us kind of a really good sense check. We also have a survey that you'll be able to see on the screen. Again, we'd love your feedback and your thoughts. So if you could just take a moment to complete that, we'd very much appreciate that as well. So thank you everybody for joining. We still have a couple more Optimise sessions coming up. All of them are available on demand as well. So all the sessions are available on the agenda landing page and on the console. So thank you so much. And thanks again to Quincey, and we'll hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.